Hi everyone, let's look at chapter questions, The Secret River, and part 3, Clearing in the Forest. The actual title here, Clearing in the Forest, gives us an indication of what this particular chapter will be about. It's about marking their place, the Thornhill Point, with the Thornhill's new life. So that'll involve building a cabin, planting the corn, cutting down the trees, securing the perimeter, and even making a yard for Sal. We also meet the neighbours in this particular chapter, and during this particular time we get a sense of Sal's fragility, the one person in Will's life who has been a pillar of strength, and how she is vulnerable to illness and how difficult it is to be ill in this isolated and quite remote area. So question number 1 that we were going to go through in class today is about how he buys a gun before he leaves. So if you go to page 131, it's the incident where Mallory, who has a superior kind of smile, sells the gun to Will. Now what this foreshadows is, as you would know, later on in the book on page 241. The local tribe is having what we would call a corroboree, some sort of ceremony, and it's quite loud and seemingly boisterous and terrifying for the people living in the hut, the Thornhills and Dan. And when they hear all this, Ned and Dan, they coax young Will to Thornhill to get the gun because they're terrified, and they push him and push him and push him, and he actually does fire the gun and it has very little impact. We learn a lot about Dick in that event because he says there ain't no call for the gun, so we get a sense of Dick's character, and it's set up in contrast to Willie, who desperately wants his father to get a gun as well. Dan even speaks about the knife he has. Now they are grossly outnumbered, but the gun is much more powerful than any of the weaponry that the local tribe has. So this purchasing of a gun really foreshadows later violence. And then of course after that incident where he's fired the gun, there is this the massacre where there is the killing of the Indigenous characters. So 131 really sets us up for the later massacre at the end of the novel. It's an important scene. The second question here is, how does Grenville build the sense of unease which grips Sal and the children when they land? In this section they seem alien in the place where William wants to settle. What conflict does this suggest? And I've asked you to read 135 to 139. You might want to pause to go back through it. But if you want to seek out some particular quotations, you'll notice when she arrives on page 135, Willie and Will try to placate Ma, and Willie sets up the fire. He tries to coax Ma out of the boat so that she will feel comfortable. There's no one around, so the whole trip would have been a clear indication to Sal that she's far from the civilization that she's become used to in Sydney Cove. What Will notices on the bottom of 135 is that if a snake got one of them, there was no surgeon, not even a parson, to say a prayer over the corpse. So there, even though Will could not count himself as a religious man, it's this idea that all forms of connection with a bigger community are so far away. On 136, there is a feeling of doubt because when Will looks at Johnny, who's usually running all over the place, he's in the fold of Sal's skirt. Bub is whimpering. So this place is foreign to them. And even in this section, it says, for an instant, it's down the bottom of 136, for an instant he saw that it was impossible. How could such a flicker of humanity This pale-faced woman, these children, hardly old enough to walk and talk, make any impression on the vastness of this place. So the place seems enormous, too big for this small family and young family, and yet he still wants it to happen. On page 139, there is a really interesting quotation. He tells us on 138 that the gun doesn't make him feel secure, but he really wants to stay. And down at the end of this section it says that the valley was dwarfed by the ocean and leaves and wind, to be stretched out to sleep on his own earth, feeling his body lie along ground that was his. Remember we talked about that importance of ownership. He felt he had been hurrying all his life and had at last come to a place where he could stop. He could smell the rich damp air coming in the tent flap. He could feel the shape of the ground through his back. My own, he kept saying to himself, my place, Thornhill Place. There's an interesting little warning here, and Thornhill does love the land, but the wind in the leaves up the ridge was saying something else entirely. This idea that Indigenous notions of not being able to own the land are echoed in the sounds of the wind, which is a beautiful conclusion. So there is this haunting representation of the land, and a bit of a warning to Thornhill through the narrator that he can't have it entirely. In question 3, what message is conveyed by the fact that Thornhill's plants are dug up? How do the different family members respond to this event? The incident I really want to look at with this particular question is this idea that they have dug up the yam daisies and planting the corn, and the Indigenous group has come down to wait for something. Now, the way Thornhill reacts to them is one that is quite imperious. He takes on the language and affectations of the gentry as he knew them in England. And on page 144, he actually uses the term old boy, and he fancies the sound of that. He had never called anyone old boy the way the toffs did. And this idea of establishing a class system where finally Will Thornhill's not at the bottom seems prevalent, and it's extended throughout the text. The other children react differently. Willie and Dick run back with the bag of seed and they see the blacks. Bub is caught up in Sal's skirts. So is Johnny. Sal's response is quite interesting. She is the one who wants to negotiate, to give them some of their victuals. Now, they're not interested in the salted pork, but Sal's reaction, in contrast to Will's, Will wants to establish his authority, Sal wants to negotiate, is noted here. And as one of the children of the Thornhills, you might spot the difference in your parents' attitudes. By the next page, so on 146, Will actually physically shoves the man and tells him to leave and shouts no, no, no in his face. Now, the man was strong, silent, and unreactive, and the children would have noticed this reserve and dignity of the Indigenous family in contrast to Will's aggression. Remember, Will comes from a punitive society, whereas the Indigenous don't. It's about give a little, take a little. So that probably leads us into question 4, which is, how does Sal try to make peace with the native people in this chapter? Well, you'll know that she tries to negotiate. There's the incident where she gives them the hat, she gives them all names. A lot of the names are scullery-maid names, so names of the lower class, interestingly. And she also tries to give them hats and things that she would perceive as valuable. They laugh at the hats, and the hat is used in an inappropriate way, and certainly Will keeps that from Sal. But Sal's idea is to learn from these people to collect their bowls and so on, so that when she returns to England she can sell them. So though her attitude is imperious, there is a level of negotiation that occurs in the text, and especially in this section. Question number 5 says, Thornhill's hunger for place is strongly developed in this chapter. What steps does he take to claim the territory as his own? So there are all the ideas of planting a crop, building a hut, creating a yard, fencing it per se, so that he can say, this is my land. He does acknowledge that on page 150 that Sal is like a prisoner, and she actually establishes the markings on the bark of a tree near the tent. So we get a sense of them marking, even though she's marking how long she's a prisoner, she's marking her space and the time that she will be having to stay there. So that also shows it. So it becomes quite a little, I guess, home and also area on the land that belongs to them. I want to turn your attention to page 154, 155. He starts to, I guess, expand his horizon around the area, and he finds the fish. Now, the fish is quite interesting because we know now that the indigenous tribe that lives in the area has noted the arrival of Thornhill, and he actually on 154 looks at the length of the fish. It's 4 or 5 yards, and the lines were more than scratches. They had been grooved to a depth and width of an inch, standing out as bright against the grey skin of the rock as if carved that same morning. So that idea of scarring the land to show what the land offers a group is revealed in the fish. But there is also a bunch of lines around it, half overlap to the fish, and it's a pattern, and it turns out it's the hope and the arrival of Thornhill. And he sort of exclaims, all right, he says, oh my goodness. And if you notice, it says here, he heard himself exclaim, a high blurt of indignation. It was the same tone he had heard from a gentleman in Fish Street Hill when William Warner had lifted the watch out of his pocket. This idea that he'd been spotted and drawn is sort of a violation of him, because how dare this group etch him into the land without his permission, establishing his authority. He looks around and he realizes the place is full of shadows and he's not alone. And on the top of 155 it reads, it came to him that this might look an empty place, but a man who had walked the length of that fish, seen the tiller and sail of the Hope laid down in stone, had to recognize otherwise. This place was no more empty than a parlour in London, from which the master of the house had just stepped into the bedroom. He might not be seen, but he was still there. So there's a recognition on Thornhill's part that he's not alone. What he does realise, though, that even though he's not alone, he can't go back. And just before the squiggly line on page 155, he says something that is reminiscent of Macbeth. The thing about having things unspoken between two people, he was beginning to see, was that when you had set your foot along that path, it was easier to go on than to go back. Now, Macbeth actually says that when he starts his tirade and his killing, he can't go back because it's easier. He doesn't actually say it's easier, but it's the same as keeping on going in the same direction. So Thornhill's got himself in between a bit of a rock and a hard place. He's lied to Sal. He's got these private desires. He wants to conquer the land. He wants it to be his own. And it is much easier to go forward and to fight the land than to go back to where he came from, which is reinforced later.